Today I'm going to be talking to you about the U.S. vegetarian population, who these people are, and why they're vegetarians in the first place. So I have a confession. I am a vegetarian. So this project was a little bit of self-exploration and reflection on my decision. I looked at myself and my friends and what not eating meat meant and the implications it had on the other parts of my life. I thought, not everyone cannot eat meat. It's kind of a privilege thing. So knowing that, what does that mean? Is it fair for people who say it's the only way to be? Is it fair for them to say that to other people if not everyone can do it? So I have been reading some things online, and that was one of the arguments that someone had put up, that not eating meat is a privilege-based opportunity. So I wanted to explore that and see if this really was the case. So I had the idea that the ability to live a vegetarian lifestyle or eat vegetarian is class-based. How do I back this up? Well, I do a little bit of research. But before I really get into the demographics and everything, I want to look at some celebrity vegetarians and just talk about them for a little bit. So this is Rolling Stone's 100 Greatest Singers list. There are 100 people here. They're all really cool and really talented. Aretha Franklin's #1. You got Janis Joplin and David Bowie and Elvis. So these are 100 of the greatest singers. 9 of them, these ones, are vegetarians. That's Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney, Michael Jackson, Prince, Whitney Houston, Gladys Knight, Steve Perry, Morrissey, and B.B. King. Out of the 100 greatest singers, only 9 of them are vegetarian. This percentage is higher than the average population, which is kind of surprising when you think. It really shows how uncommon a vegetarian lifestyle is. It's not seen as an uncommon idea anymore. It used to be thought of as like social deviance, but vegetarianism is considered more of a common idea if it's not a common practice. So now that we've looked at this and have an idea of how rare a vegetarian actually is in real life, let's talk about what being vegetarian actually means. So a vegetarian is someone who doesn't eat meat. And there are different kinds of vegetarians. There are lots of categories. So the first one you have is a semi-vegetarian. And they might eat meat, but more often than not, they don't. And the types of meat they eat might be different. Some, like a pollo vegetarian, only eats chicken, but will not eat anything else. A pescatarian is a person who will only eat fish, but no other meats. And they choose different meats over others for different, sometimes ethical reasons or just for health-related reasons. There are also people who just don't eat red meat, and they would be considered a semi-vegetarian, as well as people who only eat sustainably farmed meats. Then there are lacto-ovo-vegetarians, which are the most common. They are people who will eat eggs and dairy, but do not eat any meat whatsoever. There are also people who just drink milk or just eat eggs, and so they would be called lacto-vegetarians or ovo-vegetarians. Then there are vegans who don't eat any meat products and sometimes also don't eat honey. Honey isn't necessarily, it's not meat, but it's still an animal-derived product because in harvesting the honey, you may kill bees and you are taking kind of their habitat away. So it's still considered animal-derived, and many vegans try to avoid all things that are animal-derived. So they also don't use things that use carmine, which are insects, or wear leather, or even eat gelatin. And that's true of a lot of vegetarians. Even if you're not vegans, a lot of vegetarians don't like to use things that are animal-derived. It's just levels of extremity. Then there are fruitarians, which is a really extreme form of vegetarianism, and it's where you don't eat anything that will kill the plant in harvesting it. So like no broccoli or cabbage, only things like beans, fruits, and nuts. So now that you know, but really the most basic definition I can give you is that you don't eat meat. When I was looking at this and thinking about it, it's like, what kind of person would be a vegetarian? So I kind of looked at myself, looked at my friends, and I thought, well, the typical vegetarian is probably going to be a white, young female, probably college-aged or college-educated. She's probably going to be liberal, and she's probably going to be upper middle class, or live in urban areas. I just figured, hey, people like me, a lot of my friends, well, they're like me, and they're going to come from similar places as me. if you live in an urban area, you have a wider availability of foods you can choose from. And also, if you have a higher income, you can afford to buy meat substitutes and a wide variety of vegetables to be able to live a very healthy and full vegetarian diet. So that's kind of my reasoning behind that. So figured, once again, white, female, college age, about 20 or so, college educated, and living in an urban place, and upper middle class. We're going to go on and look at some of the surveys from before. I used two surveys to kind of look at this relationship between income or class and vegetarianism. I used the Vegetarian Resource Group, a Harris poll conducted on their behalf. And what the Vegetarian Resource Group is, it's an organization that kind of just puts information out about vegetarianism and veganism, what it is, how to do it, how to eat properly and still live healthily, and just where you can buy things and recipes, different things like that. They just put information out there. And every year since 1994, they've been doing these national polls to see how many Americans are vegetarian. So there's that poll, and then there's another one by Gallup that I'm using for this. And it was conducted it was 2012, and I'm using the 2012 survey from the Vegetarian Resource Group also. But the Gallup poll is just part of a series of surveys to measure American consumption, and in this case, it was measuring food consumption, and it really asked the question, are you a vegetarian? That's one of the differences between the Vegetarian Resource Group and just the Gallup poll, is that the Vegetarian Resource Group asked different questions, and then from the answers to those questions, identified who was a vegetarian. They gave a definition. They asked, like, do you ever eat meat? Always, sometimes, never. So it was the people who answered never who they said, these people are vegetarians, and then they measured them on all these demographic levels. The Gallup poll, however, they did not give a definition of vegetarianism, and they asked the person who was being surveyed, are you a vegetarian? So in that sense, the Vegetarian Resource Group one, they identified who the vegetarians were, and in the Gallup poll, it was self-identified vegetarians. Even so, the numbers for both of these surveys are essentially the same. They are very, very, very close. So moving on from this, let's take a look at those surveys. So this is from the Gallup poll, and 3% of the male population in the U.S. are vegetarians, whereas 5% of the female population are vegetarians. Again, this is from the Gallup poll, so they're self-identified, but the numbers were maybe 1 point off, but still showed the trend of women more likely to be vegetarians. And this is a trend in a lot of other bodies of research too, is that women usually are more likely to be vegetarians than men are. Still, however, vegetarians in general are a much smaller percentage of the U.S. population than others. The same is true of younger people. You have the age groups 18 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, and 65 plus. Younger people are more likely to be vegetarians than older people, but as you can see, it's all really close in percentage points. Most age groups are fairly equally represented, with younger people being more so, slightly more so. Region, Northeast, Midwest, South, and West, that people who are vegetarian would typically be from a more urban area because they'd have a greater access to foods. So I figured like people from the Northeast and the Midwest would probably be more likely to be vegetarian. That wasn't exactly the case, but it's still people from like the West Coast and the Northeast have some of the higher percentages. Ethnicity. This one was surprising because Hispanics were very much represented in this. And this is confusing because Hispanics are not they are a minority. They're only about 13% of the entire population compared to other races. This might be because Hispanic is an umbrella kind of term. Hispanic can mean anyone who's like Cuban, Puerto Rican, a Spaniard, or a Mexican. So it's kind of a broad grouping kind of word, and that may be why this result is so high. Income. This is where things get kind of interesting, because my whole idea was that your class, which is really a lot based on your income, would determine whether or not you were more likely to be a vegetarian. So I figured that if you were like really poor and couldn't afford meat, you might be a vegetarian. Or if you were upper middle class and you could afford a great variety of foods, like fresh fruits and vegetables and meat substitutes, that you would be more likely. And so this was surprising because these numbers are so similar. The only one that's really low is the family income that's over 100,000. But that's because there's not that big of a group of people who have that type of income. So that's why that's so low. But then you look at more typical Americans, and they're all pretty much the same. They're pretty equally represented. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting that. The same goes for education obtained. I figured it would be college-educated people or like college goers who would be vegetarians, but not so much. While a college graduate only is kind of low, you still have mostly high school or less, some college and postgraduates. They're pretty close, so your age or your education level isn't so much a predictor of whether or not you'll be a vegetarian. However, Gallup poll did ask the question about ideology, political stuff. And I figured, and this what happened to be true, is that vegetarians are more likely to be liberal rather than socially conservative or moderate. And that seems to be the case. They also asked about marital status, and I thought this was interesting. If you're single, you're more likely to be a vegetarian than if you're married. And maybe this has to do that when you marry, you'll like change your eating patterns to match your partners, or also just because if younger people are more likely to be vegetarians, younger people are also more likely to be single. So that may account for that as well. Knowing that, I think because education, which is a predictor of income, which is a predictor of class, and actual incomes were such even numbers, I think it's safe to say that vegetarianism is not a class-based phenomenon. I did think that vegetarians would be more like me, like they would be people similar to me, because I'm similar to my friends, and my friends are vegetarians. You know, we all share kind of the same things. And I was right in thinking that because females who are young are slightly more likely than other typical Americans to be vegetarian. But as far as the total population goes, it's really slim the number of people who are compared to the rest who aren't. That being said, if it's not class-based, which I thought it was, what binds vegetarians together as a group? So I was like, well, maybe it's how they think, what they think about things, what their worldview is. So I kind of looked at a bunch of different sources, arguments for being vegetarian, like the top 10 reasons to not eat meat, or like why you should go vegetarian, lots of lists like that. And I found some themes. Most of them centered around ideas of being healthier, doing good to the environment, and the ethical questions that are raised when you're killing another thing. And also the treatment of workers and things. So ethical concerns, the environment, and health. So the environment. Some of the reasons that were cited in articles, and when I went and interviewed people and talked about them that were brought up, had a lot to do with the environment. So one of those was that factory farms, which are the large farms that feed and house a lot of the cattle or a lot of chicken or whatever animal you're raising for meat production, are really bad for the environment. People weren't happy with that because all of the, I have a good word for this, fecal matter from the farms collects and runs down into rivers that are near these fields and things. And that's just not good because that gets into the water systems and also into groundwater and just the soil, and that's not good. But also just the gas used for transportation of the animals and for running the plants of the slaughterhouses, all of it's just really producing animals and slaughtering them and packaging them and transporting them uses a lot of energy and a lot of fossil fuels. So people are like, no, I don't want to take part of that. I'm going to go vegetarian. The other one is animal welfare, which can be brought into the bigger idea of ethical concerns. I forgot to mention before that one of the reasons that people cited environmental-wise was world hunger, that if you didn't eat meat, you could help end world hunger in the sense that all of the lands being used to hold the animals and like just keep them, if those were converted to crop fields, you could feed so many more people on the amount of corn, say, that you grew than you could on the amount of pigs that you raised on that. It was just a lot more yield for the resource. But there's also the bigger ethical concerns of the people who work in the slaughterhouses and how they're treated and what they're paid and the psychological impact it has on them and being around that. Religion. Some religions say not to eat meat. You have like Jainists, I think they're called, or Buddhists. They espouse ahisma, which is like extreme nonviolence, and so killing by eating meat indirectly is something that's kind of against. But you also have like Orthodox Christianity where you're not supposed to eat pork. So religion is also a reason that people cited. It's an ethical concern for not eating animals. Also, factory farms are also just really bad for the environment, but also they're really bad for the animals. A lot of the practices are really cruel. The animals aren't treated well. They don't have like a quality life, and people are dissatisfied with that. So they're like, I'm not going to participate in that system, so I'm just not going to eat meat. Or you have people who like just say, I'm only going to do sustainable meat. I'm only going to eat that. And so moving on from like the ethical concerns, you have health. And this is one of the reasons that are cited. And it's funny because when you look at when I explain the interviews that I did, there's kind of a difference between people who did it for animals and people who did it for their health. But basically, just health-wise, some doctors say that vegetarianism is a better option, but that's more so for the reasons that like meat, especially red meat, is like really high in cholesterols and fats and things. And if you cut that out of your diet, you're just more healthy. But it's kind of debatable whether vegetarianism should be prescribed as like a better option, like a better way of eating. That's a really debatable issue. People say that it's not bad, that it does have health benefits, but it's not necessarily the best either. But yeah, so lots of antibiotics and things are put into our meats on factory farms, which is part of why some people just don't eat at all. That's a health concern. But some people are even still worried about mad cow disease, and so they're like, I'm just not gonna. But others find that when they eat vegetarian, that they choose foods that are more healthy, or they have a more variety of foods, like they eat more fruits and vegetables than they would if they had been eating meat. So they just do it because it's healthier for them personally, not because overall it's healthier. It's just like chicken nuggets or a salad kind of deal. If they're a vegetarian, if that's their reason, I'm a vegetarian, then they're going to pick the salad over the chicken nuggets, so they feel they just eat healthier when they eat under the label vegetarian. Okay, so knowing that, those three main concerns, you have people who do it for health, people who do it for the environment, and people who do it not just for animal welfare, but the overarching ethical concerns that they have about the process of factory farming or just killing animals in general. So I wanted to get a better, fill in the blanks that the stuff and the arguments for being a vegetarian did tell me, so I did some interviews. I interviewed 9 people. One was a man, and the rest were women, which is really a higher ratio than what we found, but also it is just who I talk to most. I mean, I'm a girl, so I have more girlfriends. So I interviewed them, and I asked them questions like, what kind of vegetarian are you? How long have you been a vegetarian? Why did you become a vegetarian? But then I went on and I asked them, what's your core values in life? What's important to you? Do you think animals are of the same value as people? Why or why not? And explain. So I didn't want to just know about their vegetarianism. I wanted to know how they viewed the world. That really ties into your kind of ethical and ideology overall. So the answers they gave me reiterated a lot of what I talked about. Most of them did it for health, or they did it for the environment, or they did it because they didn't like killing animals, or they were worried about the workers on the farm or whatever. It's funny though, one thing that I found is the people who were semi-vegetarians and the people who were straight up vegetarians had no meat, their worldviews were slightly different in that they didn't not value animals, but they ranked people on a hierarchy over them more so than the people who were vegetarians did. but also the people who did it for health were semi-vegetarians, and the people who did it for ethical or environmental concerns were people who totally abstained from meat. So that was a different thing. And to explain that further, I interviewed two people who only ate white meat, like chicken and fish and pork, or sometimes pork, sometimes not. And then I interviewed people, so they just did not eat red meat. And then I interviewed someone who only ate sustainably harvested foods. So like they got them from small farms and they didn't have any antibiotics, they were free range and all of that jazz. They didn't necessarily think that killing animals were wrong, but they didn't want to participate in the bigger system of factory farming, and that's why they didn't do it. So to sum this all up, vegetarianism is not necessarily a class-based phenomenon. A better predictor of whether or not someone is going to be a vegetarian is their worldview and how they think about the value of animals and nonviolence and like justice. So women and younger people are more likely to be vegetarians, but income levels were the same. Hispanics were significantly, I would say, overrepresented, so that would cause for further research into that. Doing this project, I still haven't decided whether or not killing animals is morally wrong, but I have gained a greater understanding of why people do it and why it may or may not benefit myself and my friends and family. Thank you.